Well, thank you, Stuart. What Stuart failed to tell you was he was my professor in social work all those years ago. So everything that you're about to see, he's to blame for, really. But anyway. So thank you very much for the invitation, Stuart, and it's great to be here and having, I hope, a lively discussion over the beers, wines and other drinks in the pub. What Stuart asked me to do was actually do a little bit of a cook's tour of ageing and the history of aged care and how the aged care system operates. And then I'll make some comments about the topic of greed as a motivator in the aged care system. And the reason is really to kind of set the scene for you. So hopefully by setting the scene, then Adele comes and talks about some of the things she's uncovered, and then we can get the debate going. To do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about ageing, different types of aged care, who the consumers of aged care services are, some of the history in Australia of aged care, what's happening around reform and change in the aged care system, what the funding of aged care looks like, and then what is greed like. But in actual fact, funnily enough, Stuart, I wanted to start exactly on your point, because residential aged care is in effect exists because family care doesn't always work. And that's a reality. And of course it suits governments not to fund everybody individually for care at home. It would actually be too expensive for Australia to manage that. And there is a reality we find as aged care providers that for some people, residential care actually works quite well. The fact you come into a congregate environment, you have stimulation, which if you're alone at home, you might not be getting in the same way. For some people, residential care actually works and actually enhances their quality of life. But of course, the reality is when people are thinking about aged care, families need to have realistic expectations about what a residential aged care service is actually like. And it isn't individual care. It is care in a congregate setting, and the funding level is about a quarter of that in acute care. So the amount of money we have to provide care is considerably less than the hospital system has. Now, the ageing of the population is probably very well known, but just to give you a bit of an idea, this year there's somewhere shy of 3 million Australians who are aged over the age of 70. By the year 2037, so not that long away, we will have nearly 5 million people aged over that 70 plus. And the proportion made up of the old, 85 plus, is actually increasing. And if you want to know what's the fastest growing segment of the population, it's people over 100. As a proportion, they're the fastest growing. That's actually a good news story, really, for most of us, I think. I'm not going to comment about whether Stuart's already there or not, but the government has set up a wonderful new, well-functioning system called My Aged Care, which is a call centre which has a 1-800 number and a website, and that's its mechanism for people to get into the aged care system in the last couple of years. I say it's well-functioning, which means that it isn't, but that you'll pick up my sarcasm on the way through. The major components of the aged care system in Australia, there's the Commonwealth Home Support Program, formerly known as Home and Community Care, which many of you will be familiar with things like Meals on Wheels, home nursing services, home care service. They provide basically entry-level support for people who are living at home. There's then home care packages, which are a higher level of care at home, and is funded on an individual funding basis. And then you have residential aged care. Now that was previously known as nursing homes and hostels, or high and low care, you might have heard those terms. That is 24/7 care in shared purpose-built accommodation. You have to have an assessment by an aged care assessment team, which are based in the state health systems, before you enter. The majority of older people going into aged care these days are people with complex healthcare needs or dementia. Aged care is funded and regulated by the federal government under the Aged Care Act. About 2/3 of the revenue comes from government, 1/3 from the residents. older people have a choice of how they pay, and around 45% of residents are supported by the government for their accommodation costs. Across the whole of the aged care system, residential and home care, there's around 430,000 people who are employed to provide aged care services. The majority of that workforce is in residential aged care, but the proportion of people being supported at home is growing, so the workforce in home care is also growing. There's also a substantial volunteer element, particularly in home and community care services, things like Meals on Wheels delivery. Some of you will have seen Adele's expose on AVO's retirement villages on Four Corners in recent times. I do want to just draw the distinction between retirement villages and residential aged care, because I think it's quite important to understand what the differences are, because they're often confused. Retirement villages are largely for independent older people, and they're not as a group vulnerable in the sense that frail older people who need aged care are. In fact, it's quite an ageist assumption to assume that older people who go into retirement villages are somehow a vulnerable group. Some retirement villages do provide what they call service departments, which provide a level of care and support. Retirement villages are regulated by the states and territories, not by the federal government. There are a mix of for-profit and not-for-profit operators. They're not government funded. They receive no government funding, retirement villages. And so the fees are usually made up of ingoing contributions, including what are known as departure fees, or sometimes called deferred management fees. But there are some rental options as well. So you pay that as an upfront. Then there's a recurrent charge for the common services of the delivery of the whole of the village. And there may be optional charges which you receive on an individual basis for specific services that you contract to have provided to you. If you look at the aged care system specifically, for those of you who are over the age of 70, if I asked you to raise your hand about whether you currently use an aged care service at all, either home support or residential aged care, if you were an average group, 4 out of every 10 people in the room would raise their hand as a user of aged care. So once you get to the age of 70, just shy of 40% of older people use formal aged care services. When you get to age 85, that proportion has risen to 81%. Most of that is support through the home care and home support services to people in their own homes. So around 60% of the people aged 85 plus who use formal aged care services do so in their own homes. Residential care use, around 7% of people aged 70 and over live in residential aged care, and it rises to 22% when you get to the age of 85. Not 25. The average length of stay in residential aged care has been falling for the past 15 years, and it's now just below 3 years as an average stay in residential aged care, and 22% leave within 6 months. And when I say leave, the way that most people leave residential aged care is in a coffin. The average age of entry is rising. It's now over 84 is the average age of people entering residential aged care. You've got a 60% likelihood of using residential aged care somewhere in your lifetime if you're a woman. You have a 47% chance if you're a man. And that's largely because women, you outlive us men. And if you're in a partnered relationship, you're therefore likely to be doing the caring for your elderly spouse. Talk about the history. The first services that provided help in Australia were the Benevolent Society and its institutions in the early 1800s that were formed in the early days of the White Colony. Community nursing services developed in the late 1800s, and in the early 1900s, the first private and charitable nursing homes were developed in Australia. In the 1940s and 50s, we saw the emergence of formal home care services other than community nursing. So the Home Care Service of New South Wales was actually founded during the Second World War, and Meals on Wheels was founded in the 1950s. Retirement villages and hostels really began to proliferate with government funding through the Aged Persons Homes Act in the 1950s through to the 1980s. In the 1970s, geriatric assessment teams, as they were then known, were first developed as multidisciplinary services to assess older people. They're now known as the aged care assessment teams that I mentioned earlier. In 1985, the Hawke government brought in the first National Home and Community Care Act to bring together the various funding streams and have a federal government involvement in the provision of home care services, which had previously been largely a state and local government responsibility. And in 1997, we had the Aged Care Act actually passed in federal parliament. More recently, we had the Productivity Commission do a report called Caring for Older Australians, which was released in August 2011. And that's really set the direction for aged care reform that's been underway since that time. Being a bunch of economists, they focused substantially on the economics of ageing, looking at how Australia could afford an ageing population and where we were going to actually get the money to pay for that. They believed that particularly accommodation was an individual responsibility and care should be a shared government funding responsibility. Affordability for taxpayers was fundamental to the Productivity Commission's vision, but they also talked about the need for a safety net for those who needed support. The Labor government, under Julia Gillard, released the Living Longer, Living Better reform package in 2012, and that was implemented in stages over the next couple of years. It boosted the help for people in their own home. It created what's now My Aged Care as a gateway for entry into services. It changed means testing to put more reliance on older people paying for home care and residential aged care services. It aimed to boost dementia services, support for carers, and to put some investment into support for the aged care workforce. The coalition government in more recent times has continued investments into areas like dementia care and the workforce, but has also in 2015 made changes that have seen individual funding and consumer-directed care introduced for home care packages. There's been a roadmap developed by the Aged Care Sector Committee, which is the formal advice group to the Minister for Aged Care, and I'll just read out one of the suggested destinations that they have in the roadmap, because I think it sums up quite neatly where the thinking is at the moment for the future of aged care. We should develop a single aged care and support system that is market-based and consumer-driven, with access based on assessed need. So that sense of a market-based solution to aged care, which we've seen in a lot of social care areas in recent times, you can see purveying through the aged care system at the moment. I represent the Presbyterian Aged Care groups on the National Aged Care Alliance, which is a group that brings together the national provider, consumer, union and professional peak bodies. And that group has brought out a vision for the future of aged care, which we've called Enhancing the Quality of Life of Older People Through Better Support and Care. And largely that group, driven by consumers, providers, unions and professional associations, has supported this move to greater choice and control for older people of their own aged care services. But we'll talk a little bit about what that means for greed as a motive at the end. There's just been a review of the aged care reforms that has been released in the last month. It was conducted by David Tune, and he's really outlined some further sets of reforms that might happen over the next 5 years or so that will continue a move towards a market-based, consumer-controlled environment in aged care, including potentially into residential care. Now, as all of this has been happening, the aged care system is changing in response to these different government directions. There are a reducing number of aged care providers, particularly in residential care, as we see groups consolidate and get taken over as a market develops. However, by contrast, home care is actually seeing an increase in the number of providers as people put their kind of advertising out and say, well, you can come to us now in this market-based model. All the while, though, aged care is growing. In response to that ageing population, the government is putting more and more investment into aged care. So the number of operational aged care places, both residential care and home care, is being consistently growing over the last 15 to 20 years and is projected to continue to do that. Indeed, at the moment, the federal government is spending around $18.5 billion a year on aged care. The majority of that, 2/3 of it, is spent in residential aged care at the moment. When you get into residential aged care, there are three components to the funding of residential aged care. The resident pays a basic daily living fee. It's around $49 per day, or 85% of the age pension. And that is the figure that you pay irrespective of whether you're a pensioner or not. The government then pays for the care costs, and that's up to a maximum of about $250 per day. However, if you are you're means tested, you may be, and you're an independent retiree that doesn't have a pension, for example, you may be requested to pay a proportion of the care costs yourself. If you are asked to do that, the government doesn't then pay the provider its contribution to the care costs. So sometimes people get confused and think that, you know, if my organisation pays you, charges you a means-tested care fee, somehow we've got extra money to spend on you. No, we don't, because the government contribution is cut in exact proportion to the amount that they request you to pay, and you're assessed for that via Centrelink or DVA if you're a veteran. The resident also pays for their accommodation costs. Now, some of you will have heard of accommodation bonds or refundable accommodation deposits. The average across Australia refundable accommodation deposit is now $380,000 for entry into aged care. If you're a low means resident who cannot afford to pay that, or you don't own your own home or whatever, then the government pays the aged care provider a subsidy to support your accommodation costs, and that's up to a maximum of $55 per day. Around 44% of residents are low means, supported by the government with their accommodation costs. 56% pay through a lump sum, or you can choose to pay as a daily payment as an alternative. The average income for all aged care services in Australia is around $243 per day. So when you add all the sources of income together, that's what we tend to get. That's actually less than we spend on the care of older people. The average expenditure is actually $248 per day, of which 2/3 goes on the staff. Now, what happens is that the contributions, therefore, from the residents and the government don't cover the costs of the provision of the care and the accommodation. What makes up the balance is other income sources that the aged care providers have. Interest, maybe additional service fees that they can charge, sale of assets, donations, particularly in the case of not-for-profit organisations. Only around 2/3 of providers make a profit in residential aged care. 31% actually make a loss in any one year. For-profit homes do tend to make higher profits. They tend to have higher levels of income and lower costs, including less staff. But they do also have higher borrowings than not-for-profit organisations. So they're more risky. In terms of quality, there's an aged care quality agency that assesses aged care services against the standards. Residential care services achieve about 98% compliance with the residential care accreditation standards. Home care and home support services achieve around 80% compliance because the home care standards are newer and services are still getting used to those. There's an aged care complaints commissioner that's independent that can handle complaints. There's around 4,500 complaints that the commissioner handles each year, and those numbers are rising. The Department of Health, Federal Department of Health, can issue sanctions against providers who have failed to comply with their requirements or have placed residents or home care clients at risk, and they can take compliance action against us. There's actually a review of the quality regulatory system underway right at the moment, following some scandals down in South Australia at the Oakden facility. Some of you might have heard of some coverage of that. It was basically a kind of cross between a mental health and an aged care facility, and there was some pretty horrendous care that was provided there, and that has triggered a review by the federal government of its aged care regulatory compliance systems, and that the government has actually been provided with a report now from the independent reviewers. Kate Carnell and a professor from New Zealand were the two people who did that review. So to go finally then to the question that I was posed, is greed actually a motivator in this system? Well, my answer is yes and no. And let me tell you why both, I think, are true. Firstly, on the yes case, it's unquestionable that there's been decades of policy mindsets that have been driven by a neoliberal economic ideology in Australia. You've seen things like purchaser-provider splits, application of competition policy to social care. These policy mindsets have really driven what's happened in areas like, for example, the job network, childcare. You can see the implications across all of the areas of care services in health and community services. It's certainly true that in the last few years we've seen an increase in market share of large corporate entities, often backed by private equity funds from offshore. So around now, about 20% of all of the residential aged care beds in Australia are run by around 9 large corporations that are for-profit entities, 3 of which are listed on the stock exchange, and others of which are owned by banks or offshore investors. There is definitely a risk of private monopolies. Many of you, when I mention the name ABC Learning, will remember the scandal that happened in the childcare sector, where that particular company bought up a substantial number of childcare operations. I think they got to the point where they were over half of all the childcare operations in childcare centres in Australia at the time, and they then went bust. And when they went bust, the government was left in the invidious position of having to work out how on earth it kept childcare in Australia afloat, having basically outsourced it to the private sector. And one of the things that happened at that point was that a consortium of not-for-profit organisations came in and took over the operation of a substantial number of the childcare centres. So sometimes we in the not-for-profit sector are seen as the saviour when these sorts of things happen. There's also been a government fixation on withdrawal from capital funding of residential aged care and capping recurrent fund expenditure. That's been partly driven by the fixation on budget deficits and so forth. And you've seen that that's underpinned the shift to a greater user pays system in aged care. It's also true that there is a higher proportion of care issues, including sanctions, that apply to for-profit organisations than to the not-for-profit sector. So for all those reasons, I say, is greed a motivator? Yes. However, on the no side of the case, the reality is that most older people hold most of their wealth in Australia in housing. we have actually really pushed in Australia home ownership, and roughly home ownership is around about 70% for older people. That's why you've got that 56% of older people who are deemed in the aged care system as not needing support with their accommodation costs, because they actually own their own home. And what the government system achieves is actually the release of the value of that home for what will be their last home. When you go into residential aged care, you are actually living in the place. It's not a hospital. It's a choice that you make, up to a point, that is around your last home, where you're going to live for your last home. So it's not unreasonable when you think about it in those terms, that we have a system that says to people who have wealth, well, use it for your accommodation. We do that throughout the rest of our life. Why do we think when we get to aged care we're suddenly exempt from doing that? It's interesting, when the Productivity Commission did its report on caring for older Australians, it also, at exactly the same time, did the report that led up to the creation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS. And they came to two different conclusions. In the aged care review, they said, well, older people have had a lifetime to build up wealth, particularly in their housing. So it's not unreasonable that Australia has a system that taps into that wealth for the sake of the future of aged care. However, if you get a disability as a child or even through your working life, you haven't had the chance to have a lifetime of work behind you. So we need a different approach to support for people with a disability at a younger age. We actually need a social insurance model which all of us contribute to through taxation. It's also, another reason to say no here is the government, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is still actually the major funder of aged care. 2/3 of the revenue in residential aged care comes from the government. Also, as I mentioned on the way through, some of this is being driven by older people themselves saying we want greater choice and control. And one of the ways we want to do that is if we're going to be paying more, we want to be able to exercise more choice and control about how the services are delivered. And of course, I'm not sure whether I'll get shouted out of at this point, Stuart, but I know. Profit is not actually a dirty word. Being profitable is actually essential to any good business operation. And if we're actually going to grow and meet the demand for aged care, then organisations actually need to be profitable. I'm much more concerned about the 31% of residential aged care homes that are not profitable, which is substantially in Australia's regional areas, than I am about the 69% who make a profit. Because the 31% are the ones that are at risk at closing. And finally, promoting ourselves as the not-for-profit sector, we actually remain 60% of Australia's residential aged care system, or just shy of it. Unlike in Britain and other overseas places where the not-for-profit sector has shrunk to be a minority player in their aged care systems, in Australia we are still the majority of the aged care providers. In my own organisation's example, we have, for example, just opened in the last year or so a community care centre in our historic place where 75 years ago this year our first nursing home was opened on behalf of the Presbyterian Church in Ashfield. We've got a community care centre there, a residential aged care centre, a retirement village, all brand new and shiny. Just down the street at Paddington, on the old Scottish Hospital site, which many of you might be familiar with, we are developing a major new $150 million investment into a new aged care centre, including retirement living, cafes, theatrettes, allied health services, not bingo, I wish we could, but the Presbyterian Church doesn't allow me to run bingo in it. And so the not-for-profit sector is growing in Australia, we're not shrinking, and we're actually providing services where if I make a profit in Paddington, I can reinvest it into the support services that we run in Walker in New England for disadvantaged communities. So our ethos as the not-for-profit sector is quite different as a motivator from the ethos that drives the for-profit commercial sector. So I guess to conclude, Stuart, my sense is, yes, of course greed is a motivator, it always is, we're human beings, but also no, I don't think the whole of the aged care system is marked by greed. Thank you.